Eu passo a palavra para o Dr. Éric Archambault.
Well, first I'd like to thank Abel for inviting me here. It's always very nice to come to Brazil. I always appreciate my stays here. So we were tasked with speaking with the universalization of open access. And I didn't like it. I think we have to speak about scientific dissemination here. It's open access is one of the vehicles. We have to think in broader terms, I think. So that's why I'm going to try to explode this box a little bit. I'd like to present excuses. I didn't have enough time to do a short presentation, so I made a long one. So what are we talking about when we're speaking about universalization and universal? Of relating to, affecting the entire universe, including relating to or affecting all members of the class or group under consideration, done, produced, or shared by all members of the class or group under consideration, adapted or adjustable to many sizes, uses of device, encompassing all of the members. Do we do this in the scientific community? No, we fail all the time. It's an extremely exclusive community, and I think all of us are complacent in reproducing this behavior. And I think universalization is not enough. It's just one of the norms for an improved research system. And, well, of course, it's something that is a bit galvauded, but I think we need to embrace the utopia of Merton, because it was a utopia. It's not a description of the system, it's perhaps more a prescription of the system. Speaking of communalism, all scientists should have equal ownership of scientific goods. Universalism, scientific validity is independent of the social, political status, personal attributes of its participants. Disinterestedness, scientific institutions act for the benefit of a common scientific enterprise. And, very importantly, organized skepticism. This is what we're doing here. We're complaining all the time about metrics, indicators, but I think we have to go a bit further still. So, at One Science, which is the second company that I started with my colleague Grégoire Côté. This is what we try to do, to embrace universalism and the values of open science to the extent that we are a private company and we have to make a living. So what do we do at One Science? I think asking a few questions and answering them shortly gives us a sense. We publish a journal specialized in Indo-Malaysian philology. Is this something that you're ready to index? Sure, you're welcome. Our journal does not have metadata available in English. Can you index it? Sure, you're welcome. We're Mertonian. We publish a journal in our biology department. We're doing a good job of controlling quality and checking articles for accuracy. Would you be interested in indexing it? What's the answer? No one does it. No one does it. We're all complacent in reproducing a culture of selectivity. And when you speak about selection, you speak about exclusion. And I think the South, the East, has suffered from it, non-English speakers, people outside the mainstream, and if we are not reflective, we're not going to change things. So it's not enough to complain about the big boys and everything. It's on every one of us to change a system from the inside by changing our behavior and thinking hard about what we're doing. Now, coming back to open access, which is what I was supposed to be talking about, it's very important to see that the original focus of this was on peer-reviewed journal articles, and this is our first effort at One Science. We're building a database of peer-reviewed, quality control, call them as you want, journal articles. So this is our really, our definition of our effort, but also should contain unreviewed preprints, because we're speaking about green. We're speaking of things that are available on the public internet, ready to be read, downloaded, copied, distributed, printed, searched, and linked to the full text, crawled, passed as data, and use them for any other lawful purposes. That was important. The Budapest, Berlin, and Bethesda Declaration were all seeing the importance of being able to do as much as possible with the literature so that it would flow freely, but it's not that easy. Someone I really love for his pragmatism is Peter Suber, and he thought, we're a bit stuck, we're demanding too much. And I'm also like this. I think we have to change the system progressively. If I can read an article and print it, I'm much happier than not having access to it at all. So we can demand it all, and we should. But we should be happier having something to digest than not at all. So by demanding all the time everything and by screaming when not every conditions are met, we end up not seeing what's going on and all the progresses we're doing. So here and at One Science, what we're doing, we're concentrating on this idea of gratis open access. So it doesn't mean you can do everything. You can't resell it to your brother, this paper that you just downloaded. But you can read it, and you can print it, and you can store it for your personal use. So now let's speak about where we're coming from with the colors, because there's a lot of confusion in there. We have to recognize that these colors are stemming from the Budapest Declaration, the Berlin Declaration, the Bethesda Declaration. The idea of gold open access, that it was made available by the publishers. And by contrast, they were the green open access papers. We're not speaking about journals here. And the idea was that it was indexed by other parties than the publisher. And I'll skip some details here, but it's very important to break down the complexity of open access rather than trying to put everything under a color. There's not enough colors to take 10 variables, 10 dimensions of a problem, each of them with several aspects, and then say we're going to combine this with having all the colors. We all want, we all love, we all should embrace the rainbow. It's inclusivity, but to speak in scientific terms, it's another matter, and we need to speak about clear qualifiers. Time, preservation, infringing copyright or not infringing them, licensing issues, versioning, referring in peer review. These are all important dimensions of the problems. And if you think of all these dimensions, there's way too many variations to have enough colors to speak about this intelligently. How about pale purple with a tinge of green in there? Okay, so it's very interesting. This summer, I looked at our database, which is changing all the time, and I plotted the regression curve. It looks like a line. It's because it's an exponential curve, and you can see on the y-axis that we did a log transform. This is how you see when it's a line with that kind of transform. It means that you have an exponential growth curve. And I was really happy because I thought, oh God, This is fun because in the 60s, the Éric Archambault Prize said that science or scientific publications were doubling every 15 years. And I thought, that's really great. This guy who didn't have any tools was able to plot this idea in our mind that the literature was doubling every 15 years. This is really significant because the tendency continues nowadays with all of us participating into something that started more than 100 years ago. And when we rubbish scientific journals saying, this is outdated, I prefer to, go with Mark Zuckerberg and do my stuff on Facebook or on Instagram or on WhatsApp, we shouldn't forget that scientific journals are here, they're alive, they're dynamic, and in the last 15 years, we published as many articles as we did since 1665 going to 2000. That's amazing. So there's a lot of things there. We should stop thinking that we're just reproducing and having boring ideas and sausaging some ideas. There's a lot of good material. We're extremely fertile. Now, we rerun a pipeline of OneFinder recently, and I could see that some resolution was appearing. What is really interesting is that we can see there's a pattern that is present until the end of World War II. I removed the two wars, of course, because you can always see that they have a blimp. So I removed them to have an easier exercise of fitting a regression line. Then we can see that after the war, it accelerates. The doubling period becomes shorter. And it became shorter still after the year 2000. There's really a transformation. Now journals, the number of journal articles is accelerating faster than ever before. Now, let's look at different databases that are well known, and some of them not as well known. Of course, Dimensions is a new kid on the block, and OneFinder is also a newer database. You can see, in terms of feature size, if you look from 1900 up to today, more or less the same size, but still, we're speaking of 60 million articles in the established database, Scopus and WOS, and we're speaking of close to 80 million articles in Dimensions and more than 85 in OneFinder. So there's still a sizable difference. Now, when you look at open access within these databases, there are big differences. And the technology that we developed and the way we're investing at OneScience means that we're finding way more articles than the other part in the market, which is Impact Story, which is providing data to all these multinational corporations. And the percentage of OA is completely different. So I'm going to show a bit why it's different. So here, what we can see is that in terms of indexing in the last few years, if you look at these different databases, Scopus and WOS tell about the same story. Dimension is sizably larger, and OneFinder is larger still. In terms of open access, there's a big difference. Now, here we see Scopus before they incorporated the data from Impact Story, should jump up to about the same level as the Web of Science, which did that last year, and also Dimensions is using this. But here you can see, in terms of percentage, it's a big discrepancy. Now, indexing by field is also something very important to understand the differences. So if you look at these large fields, in WOS, Scopus, and OneFinder, we're a bit similar. The difference is still very sizable, though, in terms, again, of open access between the Science Citation Index Expanded and OneFinder. We have sizably more. So how you're measuring gives you entirely different results. Now, what is really important in health, we have a coverage that is extremely deeper than the traditional databases. In the economic and social sciences, they were quite lazy. The journals are smaller, they're much harder to find, and they're much more costly to index because you have to index way less articles per journal. In the arts and humanities, that field was completely snubbed in the past. In one finder, we have more than 6 million articles in the arts and humanities. You look at Scopus, what people frequently subscribe to from '96 to today, you would have less than 1 million articles. So we have 6 times more. So this, when we speak of matrix that we couldn't do in these fields, we can't have an impact factor in the humanities. Yes, it's because it's not indexed. Of course, you can't have a matrix when you're not doing your job of indexing correctly. Now, let's look at the social sciences quickly. We can see here something really interesting. The rate of growth in the social science citation index is close to nil, like the field was dying. And our data is showing really superb growth. Of course, now we see, relative to our objective of being universal, we still have to work in the past. We don't have as good indexing as Thomson, Clarivate now, which started in 1960 indexing journals. In open access, completely different view. The view that was published not so long ago was that there was between 10 and 20% of the papers in the social sciences that were available in open access. Well, what happens when you index more deeply is that you realize that the social sciences is actually the area in the 3 large domains where the proportion of open access is greatest. In the arts and humanities, very interesting too, and I think this is the best illustration of the problem of being selective as opposed to being universal. What is this thing? The humanities are dead or what? I mean, you look at this, if it was my heart, I'd be really worried. It goes up and down a little bit. So we kill the dynamism of science by being selective, because our idea is that, well, the number of best journals must be a constant. So you're not trying to measure science, you're trying to select the best journal. So you end up building a tool that can't be used to measure. Because, again, this selectivity kills the dynamics of the system. Now, this is the denominator when you do a percentage. The numerator is the number of open access articles. Oh, there's a little drop between the Web of Science and one finder. Sizable drop. And in terms of percentage, you think, oh, nothing is happening in the humanities. Now, what is obvious? Again, we've been writing a lot, looking at science through a peephole. And this is what we do when we use the traditional databases. It's a small view on the scientific system. So we say, it's actually concentrating. Well, it's not. There's a really strong diversification of the academic journal publishers around the world if you try to be more universal, more inclusive in your indexing. And with this view, I'm sorry, Vincent, I beg to differ, is that the largest companies are actually not becoming more concentrated. Take this with a grain of salt. We still have to work on these data. They're really preliminary. It could change. We could have something where it's more or less equal. But there's a big step to reversing what we're observing here so that it would become like when we look through the peephole. Now, an important aspect, when you are selective, of course you say, well, the West is smart, you know, all these German scientists, we're going to index their journals. The global South, it's only shite. Don't need to index it. And by doing so, you can't measure open access correctly. Because in the developed countries, the scientific journals were established a long time back, and they were established with a model of subscription which was essential to pay for the prints. The South started a bit later and smarter. They used the digital world, where production cost is much lower, and made it available. So we have 69% of the journals produced in transition and developing economy that are available in open access, as against to 32% in the West. So if your database is biased towards the West, you can't measure open access. So that's why our curves are so different from the one that you get from other less inclusive. And I'm sorry to spoil the party here, but SciELO, you're reproducing the Western tendency. You're selecting the best here, but by doing so, you are not following this idea of universalism. You need, well, perhaps Abel will be happy to hear this, but you need greater budgets. Because you need, if a small company in Montreal that earned in an hour and a half last year the same amount, in an hour and a half, Elsevier earned the same revenue as us in the full year. I think with the means that you could put, you would be able to do better than we do, because, of course, we have to cover the old world. We need you to do a good job regionally, and then we can harvest the data and it becomes available to everyone. If you reproduce this model, then we have problem of not knowing what's going on, because we're measuring it through a people. I'm finishing. So despite what was reported earlier, including myself, there's newer evidence that suggests that there aren't huge differences in open access availability between the domains. It's more universal than we thought. In the arts and humanities, we reach 42% in one finder. In the social sciences, 52%, the 50% we were asking for, and 45% in science and technology. But that's allowing for 18 to 24 months of delay. You can't have everything right now, right away, at the present. We want this, for sure, we should continue to fight for it, but we have to see that a lot is already available, in large part thanks to efforts in the South. Measuring open access in traditional databases is fraught with danger. The coverage of the social sciences and humanities is insufficiently deep. The focus on established journal means that emerging OA journals are less likely to be indexed. The focus on Western countries, English language, and established journal means that emerging scientific powers are not adequately covered. And the over-reliance, this is really important, the over-reliance as a model on the DOI is really bad, because the smaller journals don't necessarily have the means to have this. And when you go back in the history, the DOI didn't exist. And not every journal is back numbered. Crossref also is really a great tool, but it's not enough. It creates bias that is difficult to say. So DOIs are not universally adopted. It's not enough. And if you use this to count DOA, you get the disaster we saw in the humanities, with very little recall. Scientific journals cannot be and should not be reduced to Crossref, Medline, and DOAJ. You can take a shortcut and say, we index this. You include everything without selection. So you put books and conference, and there you say, we've got 95 million thingy. It looks fantastic, but it's not a way of measuring. We need to be selective about the content so that we know what we're talking about. Selectivity is important there. It's a scientific object. And deep data cave and open sky mining of articles in excluded country, languages, and field is essential. long life to SciELO, an erudite of this world, because you're absolutely essential. But also, I'd like to say long life to OGS, because this diversity that we see being sustained is because of the Public Knowledge Project and OGS, without which we would definitely see a big concentration in the hand of large publishers. So congratulations, you're one of the most important instruments in the universalization of the scientific publishing market. Thank you very much.